The comparison between the U.S. prison system and slavery, particularly regarding its impact on black men, is a significant and contentious topic. This analogy draws attention to various social, economic, and political factors. Here are some key points that contribute to this comparison. 1. Historical context. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution allowed for involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. This loophole led to practices that essentially forced African Americans back into labor systems reminiscent of slavery. 2. Mass incarceration. Over the past several decades, particularly since the war on drugs in the 1980s, the U.S. has experienced a dramatic increase in incarceration rates, especially among black men. This phenomenon is often referred to as mass incarceration, where a disproportionate number of African Americans are imprisoned relative to their population size. 3. Racial disparities in sentencing. Studies have shown that black individuals often receive harsher sentences for the same crimes compared to their white counterparts. This disparity manifests in longer prison terms and increases in the likelihood of imprisonment for similar offenses. 4. Prison labor. Many incarcerated individuals are subjected to labor conditions that pay very little, akin to slave wages. These labor practices can be exploitative, with inmates working in industries that benefit corporations without fair compensation. 5. Social and economic impact. The overrepresentation of black men in the prison system affects families and communities, leading to socioeconomic disadvantages. Families can be disrupted, with significant consequences for children, such as increased poverty and reduced educational opportunities. 6. Community policing and criminal justice policies. Practices like stop and frisk and the criminalization of minor offenses have disproportionately affected black communities, leading to higher rates of incarceration. This systemic bias intersects with issues of poverty and lack of access to opportunities. 7. Re-entry barriers. Upon release from prison, many individuals face significant barriers, such as difficulties in finding employment, housing, and reintegration into society. This cycle can perpetuate poverty and recidivism, trapping individuals in a system that parallels historical patterns of oppression. 8. Activism and awareness. Activists, scholars, and organizations have highlighted these issues, drawing attention to the need for criminal justice reform, restorative justice initiatives, and systemic change to address racial inequalities. The comparison between the prison system and slavery in the U.S. is a complex one, drawing parallels in the ways both systems have historically and currently impacted marginalized communities, particularly African Americans. The comparison isn't about saying they are exactly the same, but rather highlighting overlapping themes of exploitation, control, and systemic oppression. Exploitation of labor. Both slavery and the current prison system utilize forced labor. Slavery, explicitly, was built on the forced labor of enslaved people. Today, incarcerated individuals are often employed for extremely low wages, sometimes for private companies, in what amounts to exploitative labor practices. This generates profit for businesses while offering inmates minimal compensation. Disproportionate impact on minorities. Both systems disproportionately affected and continue to affect minority groups. Slavery directly targeted and enslaved African people. Today, mass incarceration has resulted in a vastly higher incarceration rate for Black Americans compared to white Americans, perpetuating a cycle of systemic racism. Legalized discrimination and control. Slavery was a legalized system of oppression and control. Similarly, the modern criminal justice system, with its harsher sentencing practices, discriminatory policing, and biases within the legal system, creates a situation where certain groups are disproportionately targeted, incarcerated, and marginalized. This contributes to a system of control that mirrors aspects of the control exerted through slavery. Cycles of poverty and marginalization. Both systems create cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. Slavery stripped people of their freedom and opportunities, perpetuating poverty across generations. Mass incarceration similarly limits opportunities for employment, housing, and education, leading to ongoing cycles of poverty and marginalization, particularly for formerly incarcerated individuals and their families. Loss of civil rights. While enslaved people were stripped of all civil rights, the incarcerated also experience a significant loss of civil rights, including the right to vote in many states, limitations on employment opportunities, and restrictions on various aspects of daily life. It's crucial to acknowledge the significant differences between slavery and the modern prison system. Slavery was a brutal system of ownership and dehumanization. The prison system, while undeniably unjust and oppressive in many respects, doesn't equate to ownership in the same way. The comparison highlights systemic issues and patterns of oppression, not a direct equivalence. The analogy serves to underscore the lasting effects of racism and inequality in the U.S. and the need for systemic reform. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States, with the exception of as punishment for a crime. It was ratified on December 6, 1865, becoming the first of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. Here are some key facts about the 13th Amendment. History. The 13th Amendment was the first time slavery was explicitly mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. While the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution enshrined the importance of liberty and equality, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies in 1776. Passage. The Senate passed the amendment on April 8, 1864, by a vote of 38 to 6. The House passed it on January 31, 1865, after several failed attempts. Impact. The 13th Amendment freed 4 million slaves. However, a new form of slavery developed in the 20th century, known as convict leasing, where prisoners were leased out for forced labor. Historically, companies that employed convicts leased out for forced labor included coal mining operations, lumber companies, railroad construction firms, and agricultural businesses, particularly in the American South, where convict leasing was most prevalent, often exploiting African American laborers in harsh conditions. Notable companies like U.S. Steel have been documented as utilizing convict labor. Past. Key points about convict leasing. Era. This practice was most common in the late 19th century following the American Civil War. Exploitation. Convicts were often forced to work long hours under brutal conditions with minimal pay. State involvement. States would lease out their prisoners to private companies for profit. Modern concerns. While convict leasing is officially outlawed in the U.S., concerns remain about the potential for exploitative prison labor practices in certain industries today. Convict leasing was a system of forced penal labor that was practiced historically in the southern United States before it was formally abolished during the 20th century. Under this system, private individuals and corporations could lease labor from the state in the form of prisoners, nearly all of which were black. The state of Louisiana leased out convicts as early as 1844. The system expanded throughout most of the South with the emancipation of enslaved people at the end of the American Civil War in 1865. 2. The practice peaked about 1880 and persisted in various forms until it was abolished by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, December 12, 1941. The system was highly lucrative for both the lessees and state governments. 2. For example, in 1898, 73% of Alabama's annual state revenue came from convict leasing. 3. Corruption, lack of accountability, and violence resulted in one of the harshest and most exploitative labor systems known in American history. 4. African Americans, mostly adult males, due to vigorous and selective enforcement of laws and discriminatory sentencing, comprised the vast majority, though not all, of the convicts leased. While states of the northern United States sometimes contracted for prison labor, the historian Alex Lichtenstein notes that only in the South did the state entirely give up its control to the contractor, and only in the South did the physical penitentiary become virtually synonymous with the various private enterprises in which convicts labored. 6. The writer Douglas A. Blackman described the system. It was a form of bondage distinctly different from that of the antebellum South in that for most men, and the relatively few women drawn in, this slavery did not last a lifetime and did not automatically extend from one generation to the next. But it was nonetheless slavery, a system in which armies of free men, guilty of no crimes and entitled by law to freedom, were compelled to labor without compensation, were repeatedly bought and sold, and were forced to do the bidding of white masters through the regular application of extraordinary physical coercion. The system in various states. In Georgia, convict leasing began in April 1868, when Union General and newly appointed Provisional Governor Thomas H. Ruger issued a convict lease for prisoners to William Fort for work on the Georgia and Alabama Railroad. 9. The contract specified 100 able-bodied and healthy Negro convicts, in return for a fee to the state of $2,500. In May, the state entered into a second agreement with Fort and his business partner Joseph Printup for another 100 convicts, this time for $1,000, to work on the Selma, Rome and Dalton Railroad, also in North Georgia. 21. Georgia ended the convict lease system in 1908. In Tennessee, the convict leasing system was ended on January 1, 1894 because of the attention brought by the Coal Creek War of 1891, an armed labor action lasting more than a year. At the time, both free and convict labor were used in mines, although the two types of workers were kept separated. Free coal miners attacked and burned prison stockades, and freed hundreds of black convicts. The related publicity and outrage turned Governor John P. Buchanan out of office. The end of convict leasing did not mean the end of convict labor, however. The state cited its new penitentiary, Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, with the help of geologists. The prison built a working coal mine on the site, dependent on labor done by prisoners, and operated it at significant profit. These prison mines were closed in 1966. Texas began convict leasing by 1883 and abolished it officially in 1910. 23. A cemetery containing what are believed to be the remains of 95 slave convicts has recently 2018 been discovered in Sugar Land, now a suburb of Houston. 24. The convict lease system and lynch law are twin infamies which flourish hand in hand in many of the United States. They are the two great outgrowths and results of the class legislation under which our people suffer today. Ida B. Wells. 25. Alabama began convict leasing in 1846 and outlawed it in 1928. It was the last state to formally outlaw it. The revenues derived from convict leasing were substantial, accounting for about 10% of total state revenues during 1883, 26 surging to nearly 73% by 1898. 3. Political campaigning against convict leasing in Alabama began in 1915. Bibb Graves, who became Alabama's governor in 1927, had promised during his election campaign to abolish convict leasing as soon as he was inaugurated, and this was finally achieved by the end of June 1928. This lucrative practice created incentives for states and counties to convict African Americans, and helped increase the prison population in the South to become predominantly African American after the Civil War. Citation needed. In Tennessee, African Americans represented 33% of the population at the main prison in Nashville as of October 1, 1865, but, by November 29, 1867, their percentage had increased to 58.3%. By 1869, it had increased to 64%, and it reached an all-time high of 67% between 1877 and 1879. Prison populations also increased overall in the South. In Georgia, prison populations increased tenfold during the four-decade period 1868-1908 when it used convict leasing. In North Carolina, the prison population increased from 121 in 1870 to 1,302 in 1890. In Florida, the population increased from 125 in 1881 to 1,071 in 1904. In Mississippi, the population quadrupled between 1871 and 1879. In Alabama, it increased from 374 in 1869 to 1,878 in 1903 and then to 2,453 in 1919. In Florida, convicts, most of whom were African American males, were sent to work in phosphate mines, turpentine camps, and lumber camps, although from 1910 onward all Florida state prisoners labored in turpentine and lumber camps. 28. The convict labor system in Florida was described as being severe in comparison to that in other states. 11. Florida was one of the last states to end convict leasing. The state convict leasing program was ended by Chapter 7833 of the legislature effective December 31, 1919. County convicts continued to be leased to private interests until 1923. Following the abolition of convict leasing in 1919, the number and proportion of white males sentenced to state prison increased quickly. Many prisoners labored in public road construction while others were sent to Union Correctional Institution, then known as Rayford Prison. Although opposition to the system increased during the beginning of the 20th century, state politicians resisted its elimination. In states where the convict lease system was used, revenues from the program generated income nearly 4 times the cost, 372% of prison administration. 29. The practice was extremely profitable for the governments, as well as for those business owners who used convict labor. However, other problems accompanied convict leasing, and employers became gradually more aware of the disadvantages. 30. While some believe the demise of the system can be attributed to exposure of the inhumane treatment suffered by the convicts, 31 others indicate causes ranging from comprehensive legislative reforms to political retribution. 29. Though the convict lease system, as such, disappeared, other types of convict labor continued and still exist presently. These other systems include plantations, industrial prisons, and chain gangs. The convict lease system was gradually phased out during the early 20th century due to negative publicity and other factors. Industrial prison refers to a system where incarcerated individuals are forced to work for private companies, essentially turning prison labor into a source of profit, and this practice still exists today, primarily within the concept of the prison industrial complex, PIC, where private corporations contract with government prisons to utilize inmate labor for manufacturing goods at low costs, contributing to mass incarceration issues in the United States. Critics argue that this system exploits prisoners and incentivizes keeping prison populations high to maintain profits. Key points about industrial prisons today. Private prisons. Most industrial prison systems operate through private companies that contract with government agencies to manage prisons, where the profit motive can incentivize keeping a large inmate population. Types of labor. Prison labor can be used for a variety of tasks, including manufacturing clothing, furniture, electronics, license plates, and even agricultural work, often at significantly lower wages than what would be paid to non-incarcerated workers. Criticisms. Concerns about industrial prisons include exploitation of labor. Prisoners are often forced to work long hours under poor conditions for minimal pay. Low quality goods. Products made by prison labor may be of lower quality due to pressure to produce large quantities quickly. Mass incarceration. The profit motive can lead to policies that contribute to higher incarceration rates. Impact on communities. Some argue that industrial prisons concentrate in economically depressed areas, creating a reliance on the prison system as a source of jobs. While not as prevalent as in the past, chain gangs still exist in a few U.S. states like Arizona and Florida, where certain inmates are required to work together while chained to one another, often performing community service tasks like roadside cleanup, and are considered a form of punishment for disciplinary issues. However, the practice is controversial due to its association with historical racial injustices and concerns about inhumane conditions. Key points about modern chain gangs. Limited use. Only a few states utilize chain gangs, with Arizona, under former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, being a prominent example where inmates on chain gangs wear distinctive uniforms. No physical chains in some cases. While the term chain gang is used, some states may not literally chain inmates together but instead use heavy leg shackles connected by a short chain. Public work focus. Chain gang labor often involves public service projects like litter cleanup or roadside maintenance. Controversial practice. Critics argue that chain gangs are degrading and reminiscent of slavery, raising concerns about human rights violations. Louisiana for-profit prison labor. Many prisoners are forced to work on for-profit plantations, including picking cotton. Refusal to work can be met with solitary confinement and physical beatings. Prisoners in the U.S. are part of a hidden workforce linked to hundreds of popular food brands. By Robin McDowell and Margie Mason. Updated 8:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Angola. AP, a hidden path to America's dinner tables begins here, at an unlikely source, a former southern slave plantation that is now the country's largest maximum security prison. Unmarked trucks packed with prison-raised cattle roll out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, where men are sentenced to hard labor and forced to work, for pennies an hour or sometimes nothing at all. After rumbling down a country road to an auction house, the cows are bought by a local rancher and then followed by the Associated Press another 600 miles to a Texas slaughterhouse that feeds into the supply chains of giants like McDonald's, Walmart and Cargill. Intricate, invisible webs, just like this one, link some of the world's largest food companies and most popular brands to jobs performed by U.S. prisoners nationwide, according to a sweeping 2-year AP investigation into prison labor that tied hundreds of millions of dollars worth of agricultural products to goods sold on the open market. They are among America's most vulnerable laborers. If they refuse to work, some can jeopardize their chances of parole or face punishment like being sent to solitary confinement. They also are often excluded from protections guaranteed to almost all other full-time workers, even when they are seriously injured or killed on the job. The goods these prisoners produce wind up in the supply chains of a dizzying array of products found in most American kitchens, from Frosted Flakes cereal and ballpark hot dogs to gold medal flour, Coca-Cola and Riceland rice. They are on the shelves of virtually every supermarket in the country, including Kroger, Target, Aldi and Whole Foods. And some goods are exported, including to countries that have had products blocked from entering the U.S. for using forced or prison labor. Many of the companies buying directly from prisons are violating their own policies against the use of such labor. But it's completely legal, dating back largely to the need for labor to help rebuild the South's shattered economy after the Civil War. Enshrined in the Constitution by the 13th Amendment, slavery and involuntary servitude are banned, except as punishment for a crime. That clause is currently being challenged on the federal level, and efforts to remove similar language from state constitutions are expected to reach the ballot in about a dozen states this year. Some prisoners work on the same plantation soil where slaves harvested cotton, tobacco and sugarcane more than 150 years ago, with some present-day images looking eerily similar to the past. In Louisiana, which has one of the country's highest incarceration rates, men working on the farm line still stoop over crops stretching far into the distance. Willie Ingram picked everything from cotton to okra during his 51 years in the state penitentiary, better known as Angola. During his time in the fields, he was overseen by armed guards on horseback and recalled seeing men, working with little or no water, passing out in triple-digit heat. Some days, he said, workers would throw their tools in the air to protest, despite knowing the potential consequences. They'd come, maybe 4 in the truck, shields over their face, billy clubs, and they'd beat you right there in the field. They beat you, handcuff you and beat you again, said Ingram, who received a life sentence after pleading guilty to a crime he said he didn't commit. He was told he would serve 10.5 years and avoid a possible death penalty, but it wasn't until 2021 that a sympathetic judge finally released him. He was 73. The number of people behind bars in the United States started to soar in the 1970s just as Ingram entered the system, disproportionately hitting people of color. Now, with about 2 million people locked up, U.S. prison labor from all sectors has morphed into a multi-billion-dollar empire, extending far beyond the classic images of prisoners stamping license plates, working on road crews or battling wildfires. Though almost every state has some kind of farming program, agriculture represents only a small fraction of the overall prison workforce. Still, an analysis of data amassed by the AP from correctional facilities nationwide traced nearly $200 million worth of sales of farmed goods and livestock to businesses over the past 6 years, a conservative figure that does not include tens of millions more in sales to state and government entities. Much of the data provided was incomplete, though it was clear that the biggest revenues came from sprawling operations in the South and leasing out prisoners to companies. Corrections officials and other proponents note that not all work is forced and that prison jobs save taxpayers money. They also say workers are learning skills that can be used when they're released and given a sense of purpose, which could help ward off repeat offenses. In some places, it allows prisoners to also shave time off their sentences. And the jobs provide a way to repay a debt to society, they say. While most critics don't believe all jobs should be eliminated, they say incarcerated people should be paid fairly, treated humanely, and that all work should be voluntary. Some note that even when people get specialized training, like firefighting, their criminal records can make it almost impossible to get hired on the outside. They are largely uncompensated, they are being forced to work, and it's unsafe. They also aren't learning skills that will help them when they are released, said law professor Andrea Armstrong, an expert on prison labor at Loyola University New Orleans. It raises the question of why we are still forcing people to work in the fields. A shadow workforce with few protections. In addition to tapping a cheap, reliable workforce, companies sometimes get tax credits and other financial incentives. Incarcerated workers also typically aren't covered by the most basic protections, including workers' compensation and federal safety standards. In many cases, they cannot file official complaints about poor working conditions. These prisoners often work in industries with severe labor shortages, doing some of the country's dirtiest and most dangerous jobs. The AP sifted through thousands of pages of documents and spoke to more than 80 current or formerly incarcerated people, including men and women convicted of crimes that ranged from murder to shoplifting, writing bad checks, theft or other illegal acts linked to drug use. Some were given long sentences for nonviolent offenses because they had previous convictions, while others were released after proving their innocence. Reporters found people who were hurt or maimed on the job, and also interviewed women who were sexually harassed or abused, sometimes by their civilian supervisors or the correctional officers overseeing them. While it's often nearly impossible for those involved in workplace accidents to sue, the AP examined dozens of cases that managed to make their way into the court system. Reporters also spoke to family members of prisoners who were killed. One of those was Frank Dwayne Ellington, who was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after stealing a man's wallet at gunpoint, a result of Alabama's Habitual Offenders Act. In 2017, Ellington, 33, was cleaning a machine near the chicken kill line in Ashland at Koch Foods, one of the country's biggest poultry processing companies, when its whirling teeth caught his arm and sucked him inside, crushing his skull. He died instantly. During a years-long legal battle, Koch Foods at first argued Ellington wasn't technically an employee, and later said his family should be barred from filing for wrongful death because the company had paid his funeral expenses. The case eventually was settled under undisclosed terms. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration fined the company $19,500, saying workers had not been given proper training and that its machines had inadequate safety guards. It's somebody's child, it's somebody's dad, it's somebody's uncle, it's somebody's family, said Ellington's mother, Alicia Powell Clark. Yes, they did wrong, but they are paying for it. The AP found that U.S. prison labor is in the supply chains of goods being shipped all over the world via multinational companies, including to countries that have been slapped with import bans by Washington in recent years. For instance, the U.S. has blocked shipments of cotton coming from China, a top manufacturer of popular clothing brands, because it was produced by forced or prison labor. But crops harvested by U.S. prisoners have entered the supply chains of companies that export to China. While prison labor seeps into the supply chains of some companies through third-party suppliers without them knowing, others buy direct. Mammoth commodity traders that are essential to feeding the globe like Cargill, Bunge, Louis Dreyfus, Archer Daniels Midland and Consolidated Grain and Barge, which together post annual revenues of more than $400 billion, have in recent years scooped up millions of dollars worth of soy, corn and wheat straight from prisons, which compete with local farmers. The AP reached out for comment to the companies it identified as having connections to prison labor, but most did not respond. Cargill acknowledged buying goods from prison farms in Tennessee, Arkansas and Ohio, saying they constituted only a small fraction of the company's overall volume. It added that, "We are now in the process of determining the appropriate remedial action." McDonald's said it would investigate links to any such labor, while Archer Daniels Midland and General Mills, which produces gold medal flour, pointed to their policies in place restricting suppliers from using forced labor. Whole Foods responded flatly, "Whole Foods Market does not allow the use of prison labor in products sold at our stores." Bunge said it sold all facilities that were sourcing from correction departments in 2021, so they are no longer part of Bunge's footprint. Dairy Farmers of America, a cooperative that bills itself as the top supplier of raw milk worldwide, said that while it has been buying from correctional facilities, it now only has one member dairy at a prison, with most of that milk used inside. To understand the business of prison labor and the complex movement of agricultural goods, the AP collected information from all 50 states, through public records requests and inquiries to corrections departments. Reporters also crisscrossed the country, following trucks transporting crops and livestock linked to prison work, and tailed transport vans from prisons and work release sites heading to places such as poultry plants, egg farms and fast food restaurants. A lack of transparency and, at times, baffling losses exposed in audits, added to the challenges of fully tracking the money. Big-ticket items like row crops and livestock are sold on the open market, with profits fed back into agriculture programs. For instance, about a dozen state prison farms, including operations in Texas, Virginia, Kentucky and Montana, have sold more than $60 million worth of cattle since 2018. As with other sales, the custody of cows can take a serpentine route. Because they often are sold online at auction houses or to stockyards, it can be almost impossible to determine where the beef eventually ends up. In Louisiana, an AP reporter watched as 3 long trailers loaded with more than 80 cattle left the state penitentiary. The cows raised by prisoners traveled for about an hour before being unloaded for sale at Dominique's Livestock Market in Baton Rouge. As they were shoved through a gate into a viewing pen, the auctioneer jokingly warned buyers, "Watch out. The cows," he said, had just broken out of prison. Within minutes, the Angola lot was snapped up by a local livestock dealer, who then sold the cattle to a Texas beef processor that also buys cows directly from prisons in that state. Meat from the slaughterhouse winds up in the supply chains of some of the country's biggest fast food chains, supermarkets and meat exporters, including Burger King, Sam's Club and Tyson Foods. It's a real slap in the face to hear where all those cattle are going, said Jermaine Hudson, who served 22 years at Angola on a robbery conviction before he was exonerated. He said it's especially galling because the food served in prison tasted like slop. Those were some of the most disrespectful meals, Hudson said, that I ever, in my life, had to endure. The rise of prison labor. Angola is imposing in its sheer scale. The so-called Alcatraz of the South is tucked far away, surrounded by alligator-infested swamps in a bend of the Mississippi River. It spans 18,000 acres, an area bigger than the island of Manhattan, and has its own zip code. The former 19th century antebellum plantation once was owned by one of the largest slave traders in the U.S.
Angola State Prison, officially known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, is one of the largest maximum security prisons in the United States. Located on an 18,000-acre former plantation along the Mississippi River, it's often called Angola, named after the country in Africa from where many enslaved people were taken. The prison has a long and often brutal history, especially known for forced labor and harsh conditions, earning it a reputation as one of America's most dangerous prisons. Inmates have historically worked on the prison's farm, which operates similarly to a plantation, producing crops and livestock. Due to overcrowding, violence, and poor conditions, Angola became a focal point for prison reform efforts in the 20th century. In recent years, Angola has introduced programs aimed at rehabilitation, such as educational courses, religious activities, and vocational training. However, issues like extended sentences, the use of solitary confinement, and forced labor remain controversial, and Angola continues to symbolize some of the U.S.'s toughest prison practices.
Within days of arrival, they typically head to the fields, sometimes using hoes and shovels or picking crops by hand. They initially work for free, but then can earn between 2 cents and 40 cents an hour. Calvin Thomas, who spent more than 17 years at Angola, said anyone who refused to work, didn't produce enough, or just stepped outside the long straight rows knew there would be consequences. Today, it houses some 3,800 men behind its razor wire walls, about 65% of them black. If he shoots the gun in the air because you done passed that line, that means you're going to get locked up and you're going to have to pay for that bullet that he shot, said Thomas, adding that some days were so blistering hot the guards' horses would collapse. You can't call it anything else. It's just slavery. Calvin Thomas. Louisiana Corrections spokesman Ken Pastoric called that description absurd. He said the phrase, sentenced with hard labor, is a legal term referring to a prisoner with a felony conviction. Pastoric said the department has transformed Angola from the bloodiest prison in America over the past several decades with large-scale criminal justice reforms and reinvestment into the creation of rehabilitation, vocational and educational programs designed to help individuals better themselves and successfully return to communities. He noted that pay rates are set by state statute. Current and former prisoners in both Louisiana and Alabama have filed class action lawsuits in the past 4 months saying they have been forced to provide cheap, or free, labor to those states and outside companies, a practice they also described as slavery. Prisoners have been made to work since before emancipation, when slaves were at times imprisoned and then leased out by local authorities. But after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment's exception clause that allows for prison labor provided legal cover to round up thousands of mostly young black men. Many were jailed for petty offenses like loitering and vagrancy. They then were leased out by states to plantations like Angola and some of the country's biggest companies, including coal mines and railroads. They were routinely whipped for not meeting quotas while doing brutal and often deadly work. Incarceration was used not just for punishment or rehabilitation but for profit. A law passed a few years later made it illegal to knowingly transport or sell goods made by incarcerated workers across state lines, though an exception was made for agricultural products. Today, after years of efforts by lawmakers and businesses, corporations are setting up joint ventures with corrections agencies, enabling them to sell almost anything nationwide. Civilian workers are guaranteed basic rights and protections by OSHA and laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act, but prisoners, who are often not legally considered employees, are denied many of those entitlements and cannot protest or form unions. They may be doing the exact same work as people who are not incarcerated, but they don't have the training, they don't have the experience, they don't have the protective equipment, said Jennifer Turner, lead author of a 2022 American Civil Liberties Union report on prison labor. Almost all of the country's state and federal adult prisons have some sort of work program, employing around 800,000 people, the report said. It noted the vast majority of those jobs are connected to tasks like maintaining prisons, laundry or kitchen work, which typically pay a few cents an hour if anything at all. And the few who land the highest paying state industry jobs may earn only $1 an hour. Altogether, labor tied specifically to goods and services produced through state prison industries brought in more than $2 billion in 2021, the ACLU report said. That includes everything from making mattresses to solar panels, but does not account for work release and other programs run through local jails, detention and immigration centers, and even drug and alcohol rehabilitation facilities. Some incarcerated workers with just a few months or years left on their sentences have been employed everywhere from popular restaurant chains like Burger King to major retail stores and meat processing plants. Unlike work crews picking up litter in orange jumpsuits, they go largely unnoticed, often wearing the same uniforms as their civilian counterparts. Prisoner Christopher Terrell stands near a tractor at the Cummins unit of Arkansas's Department of Corrections Friday, August 18, 2023, in Gould, Ark. The biggest operations remain in the South, and crops are still harvested on a number of former slave plantations, including in Arkansas. Most big farms, including Angola, have largely mechanized many of their operations, using commercial-sized tractors, trucks and combines for corn, soy, rice and other row crops. But prisoners in some places continue to do other work by hand, including clearing brush with swing blades. I was in a field with a hoe in my hand with maybe like 100 other women. We were standing in a line very closely together, and we had to raise our hoes up at the exact same time and count, 1, 2, 3, chop, said Faye Jacobs, who worked on prison farms in Arkansas. Jacobs, who was released in 2018 after more than 26 years, said the only pay she received was 2 rolls of toilet paper a week, toothpaste and a few menstrual pads each month. She recounted being made to carry rocks from one end of a field to the other and back again for hours, and said she also endured taunting from guards saying, "Come on, hoes, it's hoe squad." She said she later was sent back to the fields at another prison after women there complained of sexual harassment by staff inside the facility. "We were like, is this a punishment?" she said. "We're telling y'all that we're being sexually harassed, and you come back and the first thing you want to do is just put us all on hoe squad." David Faribault, who oversees the state's 20,000 acres of prison farms, said Arkansas's operations can help build character. "A lot of these guys come from homes where they've never understood work and they've never understood the feeling at the end of the day for a job well done," he said. "We're giving them purpose. And then at the end of the day, they get the return by having better food in the kitchens." Prisons with agricultural programs. Data from the Prison Agriculture Lab at Colorado State University show what kinds of agricultural work are being done in prisons. Some prisons are additionally identified as generating revenue from these activities. In addition to giant farms, at least 650 correctional facilities nationwide have prisoners doing jobs like landscaping, tending greenhouses and gardens, raising livestock, beekeeping and even fish farming, said Joshua Spica, director of the Prison Agriculture Lab at Colorado State University. He noted that corrections officials exert power by deciding who deserves trade-building jobs like welding, for example, and who works in the fields. In several states, along with raising chickens, cows and hogs, corrections departments have their own processing plants, dairies and canneries. But many states also hire out prisoners to do that same work at big private companies. The AP met women in Mississippi locked up at restitution centers, the equivalent of debtors' prisons, to pay off court-mandated expenses. They worked at Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen and other fast food chains and also have been hired out to individuals for work like lawn mowing or home repairs. There is nothing innovative or interesting about this system of forced labor as punishment for what in so many instances is an issue of poverty or substance abuse, said Cliff Johnson, director of the MacArthur Justice Center at the University of Mississippi. In Alabama, where prisoners are leased out by companies, AP reporters followed inmate transport vans to poultry plants run by Tyson Foods, which owns brands such as Hillshire Farms, Jimmy Dean and Sara Lee, along with a company that supplies beef, chicken and fish to McDonald's. The vans also stopped at a chicken processor that's part of a joint venture with Cargill, which is America's largest private company. It brought in a record $177 billion in revenue in fiscal year 2023 and supplies conglomerates like PepsiCo. Though Tyson did not respond to questions about direct links to prison farms, it said that its work release programs are voluntary and that incarcerated workers receive the same pay as their civilian colleagues. Some people arrested in Alabama are put to work even before they've been convicted. An unusual work release program accepts pre-trial defendants, allowing them to avoid jail while earning bond money. But with multiple fees deducted from their salaries, that can take time. The AP went out on a work detail with a Florida chain gang wearing black and white striped uniforms and ankle shackles, created after Brevard County Sheriff Wayne Ivey took office in 2012. He said the unpaid work is voluntary and so popular that it has a wait list. It's a win-win, he said. The inmate that's doing that is learning a skill set. They are making time go by at a faster pace. The other side of the win-win is, it's generally saving the taxpayers money. Ivey noted it's one of the only remaining places in the country where a chain gang still operates. I don't feel like they should get paid. They're paying back their debt to society for violating the law. Brevard County Sheriff Wayne Ivey. Elsewhere, several former prisoners spoke positively about their work experiences, even if they sometimes felt exploited. I didn't really think about it until I got out, and I was like, wow, I actually took something from there and applied it out here, said William Buck Saunders, adding he got certified to operate a forklift at his job stacking animal feed at Cargill while incarcerated in Arizona. Companies that hire prisoners get a reliable, plentiful workforce even during unprecedented labor shortages stemming from immigration crackdowns and, more recently, the coronavirus pandemic. In March 2020, though all other outside company jobs were halted, the Arizona Corrections Department announced about 140 women were being abruptly moved from their prison to a metal hangar-like warehouse on property owned by Hickman's Family Farms, which pitches itself as the Southwest's largest egg producer. Hickman's has employed prisoners for nearly 30 years and supplies many grocery stores, including Costco and Kroger, marketing brands such as Eggland's Best and Land O'Lakes. It is the state corrections department's largest labor contractor, bringing in nearly $35 million in revenue over the past 6 fiscal years. The only reason they had us out there was because they didn't want to lose that contract because the prison makes so much money off of it, said Brooke Counts, who lived at Hickman's desert site, which operated for 14 months. She was serving a drug-related sentence and said she feared losing privileges or being transferred to a more secure prison yard if she refused to work. Counts said she knew prisoners who were seriously hurt, including one woman who was impaled in the groin and required a helicopter flight to the hospital and another who lost part of a finger. Hickman's, which has faced a number of lawsuits stemming from inmate injuries, did not respond to emailed questions or phone messages seeking a response. Corrections Department officials would not comment on why the women were moved off-site, saying it happened during a previous administration. But a statement at the time said the move was made to ensure a stable food supply while also protecting public health and the health of those in our custody. Some women employed by Hickman's earned less than $3 an hour after deductions, including 30% taken by the state for room and board, even though they were living in the makeshift dormitory. While we were out there, we were still paying the prison rent, Counts said. What for? Following the money. The business of prison labor is so vast and convoluted that tracing the money can be challenging. Some agricultural programs regularly go into the red, raising questions in state audits and prompting investigations into potential corruption, mismanagement, or general inefficiency. Nearly half the agricultural goods produced in Texas between 2014 and 2018 lost money, for example, and a similar report in Louisiana uncovered losses of around $3.8 million between fiscal years 2016 and 2018. A separate federal investigation into graft at the for-profit arm of Louisiana's correctional department led to the jailing of 2 employees. Correctional officials say steep farming expenditures and unpredictable variables like weather can eat into profits. And while some goods may do poorly, they note, others do well. Prisons at times have generated revenue by tapping into niche markets or to their state's signature foods. During the 6-year period the AP examined, surplus raw milk from a Wisconsin prison dairy went to Belgio Ioso cheese, which makes Polly-O string cheese and other products that land in grocery stores nationwide like Whole Foods. A California prison provided almonds to Minturn Nut Company, a major producer and exporter. And until 2022, Colorado was raising water buffalo for milk that was sold to giant mozzarella cheesemaker Leprino Foods, which supplies major pizza companies like Domino's, Pizza Hut and Papa John's. But for many states, it's the work release programs that have become the biggest cash generators, largely because of the low overhead. In Alabama, for instance, the state brought in more than $32 million in the past 5 fiscal years after garnishing 40% of prisoners' wages. Aerial video shows Cargill's barge terminal and headquarters near Minneapolis, Minnesota. Cargill and other commodity traders have in recent years scooped up millions of dollars worth of soy, corn and wheat straight from prisons. AP video Mark Van Cleave. In some states, work release programs are run on the local level, with sheriffs frequently responsible for handling the books and awarding contracts. Even though the programs are widely praised by the state, employers and often prisoners themselves, reports of abuse exist. In Louisiana, where more than 1,200 companies hire prisoners through work release, sheriffs get anywhere from about $10 to $20 a day for each state prisoner they house in local jails to help ease overcrowding. And they can deduct more than half of the wages earned by those contracted out to companies, a huge revenue stream for small counties. Jack Strain, a former longtime sheriff in the state's St. Tammany Parish, pleaded guilty in 2010 involving the privatization of a work release program in which nearly $1.4 million was taken in and steered to Strain, close associates and family members. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which came on top of 4 consecutive life sentences for a broader sex scandal linked to that same program. Incarcerated people also have been contracted to companies that partner with prisons. In Idaho, they've sorted and packed the state's famous potatoes, which are exported and sold to companies nationwide. In Kansas, they've been employed at Russell Stover Chocolates and Cal-Maine Foods, the country's largest egg producer. Though the company has since stopped using them, in recent years they were hired in Arizona by Taylor Farms, which sells salad kits in many major grocery stores nationwide and supplies popular fast food chains and restaurants like Chipotle Mexican Grill. Some states would not provide the names of companies taking part in transitional prison work programs, citing security concerns. So AP reporters confirmed some prisoners as private employers with officials running operations on the ground and also followed inmate transport vehicles as they zigzagged through cities and drove down country roads. The vans stopped everywhere from giant meat processing plants to a chicken and daiquiri restaurant. Spanish moss hangs from trees lining a courtyard at the Myrtles, a former antebellum home slave plantation turned wedding venue and tourist site. One pulled into the manicured grounds of a former slave plantation that has been transformed into a popular tourist site and hotel in St. Francisville, Louisiana, where visitors pose for wedding photos under old live oaks draped with Spanish moss. As a reporter watched, a West Feliciana Parish van emblazoned with Sheriff Transitional Work Program pulled up. 2 black men hopped out and quickly walked through the restaurant's back door. One said he was there to wash dishes before his boss called him back inside. The Myrtles, as the antebellum home is known, sits just 20 miles away from where men toil in the fields of Angola. Former Angola prisoner, Curtis Davis, talks about his time at the Louisiana State Penitentiary during a 2021 interview near a former antebellum slave plantation near Angola. Slavery has not been abolished, said Curtis Davis, who spent more than 25 years at the penitentiary and is now fighting to change state laws that allow for forced labor in prisons. It is still operating in present tense, he said. Nothing has changed. AP videographers Robert Bumstead and Cody Jackson contributed to this report.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content, and leave a comment below. See you next time.